In the deep folds of Middle-earth's lore, the hobbits, known also as halflings, first emerged onto the scene. Their actual origin or beginning is somewhat of a mystery, really. Theirs is a story half forgotten by men and overlooked by the great powers, because the hobbits were a folk humble by nature, naturally reclusive and happy to live on, unnoticed. The early history is not definitively explained in The Lord of the Rings or any other writings of Tolkien. But from what little we know, it seems like they're a sort of subgroup of men who became distinct over many ages. And by the time they'd been discovered by the other races, the hobbits had already been around for generations. It's believed that hobbits first appeared in the eastern bit of Middle-earth during the early Third Age. The earliest group of known hobbits lived in the wide lands by the banks of the Anduin River, in the shadow of the misty mountains and under the darkening eaves of Mirkwood, the elven forest. At this time, they hadn't yet developed the customs, lifestyle, or even the culture we associate with them in the Shire. They were a migratory people, ever on the move, mostly due to the ebb and flow of the other peoples and environmental changes and things of that sort. From these early hobbits, 3 distinct kinds, or breeds, came about. These were the Harfoots, the Stores, and the Falahides. Even though they did share a lot in common, being hobbits and all, each group still had its own traits and tendencies, even differences in physical appearance and temperaments, shaped by the lands they wandered and the lives they led. Harfoots, who were the most numerous of the 3 groups, were of a smaller, sturdier sort, with browner skin and nimble feet, well suited for the hillsides and woodlands they favored, which is why they were the first to turn their eyes westward, traveling across the northern region of Eriador. In olden times, they were really friendly with the dwarfs of Middle-earth, since they had regular contact with them and lived in the foothills of the Misty Mountains for a long time. It is from the Harfoots that the Shire folk, the hobbits we've grown to love in tale and song, would most descend. Now the Stores, on the other hand, were broader and heavier in build, often living near rivers and water sources. They were the ones who most resembled men, and were actually the only hobbits that could grow facial hair. They had a slightly more adventurous nature and are quite unique for their ability to swim, despite the fact that most hobbits had a strong fear of rivers. The most infamous Store is Smeagol, who of course would later be known as the creature Gollum. And finally, the Falahides were taller, fairer, and the most adventurous of the bunch. These were the least common type of hobbits, and they had a better relationship than most with the elves of Middle-earth. The Falahides were lovers of trees and forests, were skilled with language and song, and preferred hunting over farming. Also, they were generally more inclined to leadership roles. And indeed, the Falahides would often become leaders of the various hobbit groups during their migration westward. As the years of the Third Age passed, and the shadow of Sauron once again began to stir in the world, the hobbits found themselves on the move. They were driven westward, fleeing wars and the creeping malice of the Dark Lord. In those early days, they lived a life of foraging and hunting, traveling from place to place with no true home to call their own. By around the year 1050 of the Third Age, hobbits began to settle in Erebor. But each group took a different path westward into these lone lands. Some crossed the Misty Mountains and went down as far as the South Downs. Others ended up north of Rivendell. And the Stores would settle in Swanfleet, a marshy region. Although they would end up fleeing back towards the Misty Mountains when Angmar's power was terrorizing the Kingdom of Arnor. It was around 1601 of the Third Age when two Falahide brothers, Marco and Blanco, led a large group of hobbits west across the Brandywine River, specifically to a fertile stretch of land that would eventually become the Shire. The Shire was initially granted to the hobbits by the King of Arthedain under a simple agreement. They were to acknowledge his rule and make sure the land remained free from the encroachment of large settlements by outsiders. In return, the hobbits were left to govern themselves with little oversight from the distant throne. But the Kingdom of Arnor had long since waned. Its strength fractured and its influence faded after the long war with the Witch King of Angmar. Corruption plagued its lands and peoples. And so from the very beginning, the hobbits lived in near complete autonomy. This freedom allowed them to craft their own way of life, untouched by the greater struggles of Middle-earth, and to nurture a culture so uniquely their own, safe from the turmoil of the world beyond their borders. This settlement here marks a pretty significant turning point for the hobbits, and they began to develop into a more agrarian lifestyle, growing crops, building homes, and expanding on the culture that would define them. By the time we get to meet them in the stories, the Shire, for the most part, enjoyed a life of peace and quiet. But there were a few moments in its history when trouble came knocking at its borders. One such time happened in the year 2747 of the Third Age, when a band of orcs, led by a ruthless chieftain named Gulfimbol, invaded the Shire. It was a really unusual and alarming event for the hobbits, who'd never faced such danger before. But it was in this moment that a hobbit named Bandabras Took, known as the Bull Roarer, rose to the occasion. In the Battle of Greenfields, Vandabras led the charge, and famously knocked Gulfimbol's head clean off with a club, sending it flying into a rabbit hole, thus inventing the game of golf. Or so the story goes. The victory was a proud moment for the Shire, a rare taste of heroism in their otherwise quiet lives up to that point. Years later, in 2912, a harsh winter brought more trouble. White wolves descended from the north, prowling through Eriador and slipping into the Shire during a time of deep cold and hunger. The wolves, driven by the unforgiving winter, attacked livestock and even hobbits themselves, leading to a time of famine and fear. Many hobbits perished during that long, bitter season. But as always, the Shire endured. These moments of hardship, though rare, reminded the hobbits that even their peaceful corner of the world was not immune to the darker forces beyond its borders. So the Shire itself was originally divided into 4 farthings: the North Farthing, South Farthing, East Farthing, and West Farthing. I guess you can think of these as different boroughs of the Shire. Each had its own towns, villages, and farmland. But the Shire as a whole was remarkably unified by Hobbit standards. Later on, during the Fourth Age, a couple more regions were added onto the Shire proper. The East Farthing, located near the Brandywine River, was the region most closely connected to the world outside, while the West Farthing was home to Hobbiton and the more rural and isolated bits of the Shire. The Shire, in its modesty, really didn't have much appeal for the great powers of Middle-earth. Its small size, lack of strategic position, and unremarkable resources made it an unworthy prize for the ambitions of the dark forces. Even the hobbits themselves, humble and unassuming, were not of interest to the mighty kingdoms beyond. But the true safeguard of the Shire wasn't only in its insignificance, but in the unseen protection of the Dunedain Rangers. These watchful guardians patrolled its borders, ensuring that no harm befell the peaceful folk within. Over time, though, the hobbits, long accustomed to peace, grew forgetful of these protectors, and most of the current hobbits didn't even know of their existence. Hobbits were a folk deeply tied to the earth, and so their homes, known as hobbit holes or smiles, were carved into the very hills and mounds of the Shire. These cozy burrows were as much a part of the landscape as the trees and rivers, designed for comfort and simplicity. But as the years rolled on, some hobbits, especially those with a touch more wealth or adventure in their blood, began to build houses above the ground. Even so, the essence of hobbit architecture didn't really change. Round doors and windows that invited warmth, hearths at the heart of every home, and a deep connection to the world outside. To a hobbit, a home wasn't just a place to live, but a reflection of their way of life, rooted in comfort and quiet, with the natural world always at arm's reach. Their early culture grew slowly until it eventually became the way of life that defines what it is to be a hobbit, in the minds of many at least. When the Shire was first settled, farming became the heart of their existence. Hobbits were masters of the land, growing crops, brewing fine ales, and tending to gardens with a care that seemed almost instinctual. Fields of wheat and barley stretched across the Shire, and flower gardens bloomed in every corner. But of all the things they grew, probably the most famous was pipeweed, a humble plant that hobbits dried and smoked. What began as a simple habit among their people soon spread to the wider world. Rangers of the North took up the practice, and even Gandalf became quite fond of it. And you'd often see him puffing thoughtfully on his pipe. Alongside pipeweed, the hobbits became known for their brewing, particularly in the South Farthing, where the richest soil produced the finest of ales. A hobbit could speak with pride about the ale from his or her village tavern, knowing that nothing in the wide world could quite compare. But for all their skill in farming and brewing, What truly set hobbits apart was their sense of community. They were a people who valued family, friendship, and above all, hospitality. They took every opportunity to gather together. Whether it was feasts, festivals, or a good old party. Hobbits prided themselves on their ability to throw a celebration like no other. With food and drink flowing in abundance, and laughter echoing through the mounds of the Shire. And in true Hobbit fashion, their birthdays became an occasion for giving instead of receiving. On their special day, it was the birthday Hobbit who handed out gifts. In the end, Hobbit culture wasn't about grand gestures or noble quests. It was about the simple joys of a well-tended garden, a good pipe, and the warmth of friends and family gathered around a table. It was a life lived close to the earth, but with hearts open to the world. And then along came Bilbo Baggins. For generations, the hobbits of the Shire had lived quietly, untouched by the great events of Middle-earth. But that changed in the year 2941 of the Third Age, when a hobbit by the name of Bilbo Baggins, a well-to-do, decidedly unadventurous resident of Hobbiton, found himself swept into an adventure unlike any the Shire had ever known. It all began when the wizard Gandalf, along with a company of dwarves led by Thorin Oakenshield, came knocking at Bilbo's round green door. They had a dangerous quest ahead of them, to reclaim the lonely mountain from the dragon's smog. And, to Bilbo's shock, they wanted him to be their burglar. Now Bilbo wasn't the sort to go on adventures. In fact, he was quite happy with his books, his garden, and his comfortable little hobbit hole. But Gandalf had other plans, and soon, despite all his protests, Bilbo found himself swept up in a journey that would take him far beyond the safety of the Shire. Trolls, goblins, dragons, and even the mysterious elves became part of his story. But none left as deep an impression on him as the strange, twisted creature called Gollum. Deep under the misty mountains, in a dark and forgotten place, Bilbo came upon a small golden ring. A ring that seemed harmless enough, but would soon reveal itself to be much more than a simple trinket. This, of course, was the One Ring. But at that point, Bilbo didn't know of its true nature. For him, it was just a lucky find. But this ring, once forged by the Dark Lord Sauron, was destined to change not just Bilbo's life, but the fate of all Middle-earth. He returned to the Shire around a year later, as a wealthier and more worldly hobbit, what with being a key part in defeating the fearsome Smaug, and in the restoration of the dwarven kingdom of Eredibor. But predictably, his newfound fame as an adventurer caused a stir among the conservative hobbits of Hobbiton. They looked on his travels and riches with a mix of admiration and suspicion. Despite this, maybe as a testament to just how protective hobbits were of their peace, Bilbo's story did little to change the general insularity of the Shire. Hobbits continued to live as they always had, largely uninterested in the wider world. But Bilbo had brought with him a piece of the dark history of Middle-earth, in the form of the ring. The ring granted its bearer invisibility, which Bilbo used sparingly to get out of some tight spots and situations. But it also had a much darker influence, slowly extending its control over him. For decades, Bilbo lived a long and seemingly untroubled life. But the ring subtly extended his lifespan and began to affect his mind. Now, hobbits, being naturally resistant to the seductive power of the ring, kept Bilbo relatively free from its darker effects for many years. Nevertheless, its influence was always present. And as Bilbo aged, he became more possessive and secretive about it. While Bilbo's adventures were long over, the world outside the Shire was becoming more and more dangerous. Sauron had fully returned to Mordor by Tuntum 951, and the Dark Lord began actively seeking the One Ring, totally unaware that it was in the possession of a hobbit. He dispatched his agents, known as the Nazgul, or Ringwraiths, who, by the way, I have a whole video about on the channel if you're interested, to search for it. And although the Shire was still safe for the time being, it was clear that the peaceful days of the hobbits were coming to an end. At this time, Gandalf started to suspect that Bilbo's ring might be more than it appeared. He got deeply suspicious when Bilbo's behavior became more erratic, and he began investigating the history of the One Ring. Many years later, Bilbo threw a grand birthday party to celebrate his 11th birthday, during which he intended to leave the Shire and pass the ring on to his younger cousin and heir, Frodo Baggins. He got cold feet, though, and considered keeping it at the end. Its power over him had grown too strong. But with Gandalf's stern encouragement and advice, Bilbo ended up reluctantly parting with the ring and left the Shire. Even Gandalf was too afraid to be tempted, and so the ring passed to Frodo. Frodo, much like Bilbo before him, was unaware of the truth of what he held. But a few years later, when Gandalf had confirmed that the ring Frodo had was indeed the Master Ring, he revealed this to the young hobbit, and he gave him a dire warning that the Dark Riders were on the hunt, and the ring had to be taken far away, far from the Shire. So after a very long and very difficult journey that took Frodo and his mates from the Fellowship through treacherous orc-infested mines, ancient elven forests, swampy marshes filled with bodies, and a big old spider's lair, to name just a few of the wonderful places they passed, they finally destroyed the ring in the fires of Mount Doom. With the ring destroyed, Frodo and Sam were rescued by Gandalf and the Eagles, who carried them away from the fiery destruction of Mount Doom. The war had been won, and Middle-earth was saved. But for the hobbits, the end of the war did not mean the end of their journey. When Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin finally returned to the Shire, they expected to find their home as they had left it, peaceful, untouched by the troubles of the wider world. But instead, they found that it had been ravaged by the wizard Saruman, who had taken control in Gandalf's absence. The once cozy and idyllic Shire had been turned into a grim, industrialized wasteland, its charms smothered under smoke and grime, with many hobbies forced into servitude. Saruman couldn't take revenge against Gandalf directly, so he wanted to hurt the hobbits that Gandalf was so apparently fond of. But the four hobbits, hardened by their experiences in the war, would not stand for this. Led by Frodo and the others, the hobbits rose up against Saruman's forces, and what became known as the Scouring of the Shire. Even though this battle was small, in comparison to the great struggles of the War of the Ring, it was no less significant for the hobbits. They fought not for kingdoms or the fate of the world, but for their own home, their way of life. And so the Shire was reclaimed, and peace was restored. The land would heal, and in time, so would the hearts of the hobbits. But not Frodo. Though the Shire returned to its old ways, Frodo found that he could not. The scars of his journey ran too deep. The physical wounds from the spider Shelob's sting, the Morgul blade, and the mental weight of bearing the ring left him forever changed and unable to find solace in the life he had once cherished. In the year 3021 of the Third Age, Frodo was granted a gift, a chance to sail to the Undying Lands, where the elves and the greatest heroes of Middle-earth would dwell in peace. He left the Shire behind, along with Bilbo, Gandalf, Elrond, and Galadriel, sailing from the Grey Havens into the west. He knew it meant leaving behind the Shire and the friends he had fought so hard to protect. But Frodo accepted. He left the Shire forever, seeking peace at last in a place beyond pain and sorrow. With the fall of Sauron, Saruman, and the end of the War of the Ring, the hobbits of the Shire returned to their quiet lives. But something had changed. The once unknown and unremarkable folk had become legends thanks to the extraordinary deeds of Sam, Merry, and Pippin. These hobbits, who had never sought adventure, had somehow ended up at the heart of the greatest struggle of the Third Age. Under the leadership of Samwise Gamgee, who had grown in wisdom and stature during his adventures, the hobbits of the Shire set about restoring what had been lost during Saruman's brief reign of cruelty. During his journey, Galadriel had given him a gift, as she had with each of the other members of the Fellowship. He'd gotten a little box of plain gray wood, decorated with a single silver rune on the lid. Inside was earth from Galadriel's orchard, and the earth was like gray dust, soft and fine. Amidst the earth was a seed, like a small nut with a silver shell. With the gift of Galadriel's magical earth, Sam planted saplings everywhere that beautiful and beloved trees had been felled. And he put a grain of the precious dust in the soil at the root of each. He planted the seed to create a new party tree, which grew into a melon tree. It was said that when the tree bloomed in the next summer, all the Shire became golden from the flowers. And so, this hobbit, who had once been but a simple gardener, became one of the most respected figures in the Shire. He married Rosie Cotton, raised a large family of 16, and was elected mayor 7 times. Under his gentle leadership, the Shire flourished. His friendship with Frodo remained one of the most profound bonds of his life. And even after Frodo's departure to the Undying Lands, Sam carried the memory of their shared journey with him always. But before Frodo left, he attended his best friend's wedding and Sam and Rosie actually moved in with him at Bag End, which Frodo then gave to Sam. Until eventually, he joined Frodo in the Undying Lands, since he too had been a bearer of the ring, however briefly. Meriadoc Brandybuck and Peregrine Took, aka Merry and Pippin, had also played extremely important roles in the War of the Ring, and they returned to the Shire as heroes in their own right. Their time spent among the riders of Rohan and the soldiers of Gondor had transformed them. They weren't just mischievous young troublemakers anymore. They'd grown into warriors and leaders, respected both in the Shire and beyond. Merry became master of Buckland, and Pippin eventually inherited the title of Thane of the Shire, one of the highest positions in Hobbit society. Together, they ensured the Shire's safety and prosperity in the years following the war. Their leadership helped strengthen ties between the Shire and the kingdoms of Gondor and Rohan, where they'd formed lasting friendships. The Hobbits of the Shire, though still a relatively secluded folk, now had a quiet but very powerful connection to the outside world. The effects of their time with Treebird the Ant were also visible. After drinking the magical ant draughts, Merry and Pippin had grown taller than other hobbits, a fitting and physical reminder of the role played in Middle-earth's history. For the rest of their lives, they served as protectors and guardians of the Shire's peace. At the age of 102, Merry and Pippin, old but still full of the spirit that had carried them through so many adventures, returned to Rohan and Gondor, lands they had come to love. Though their time there was peaceful, it wasn't long before they reached the end of their long, remarkable lives. Merry passed away sometime afterwards, and both he and Pippin were laid to rest in Gondor, a final resting place among the great. When King Elisar, Aragorn, their dear friend, passed away, the two hobbits were entombed beside him as fitting companions to the king they had served and fought beside. And speaking of Aragorn, with the dawn of the Fourth Age and his rise to the throne, he made sure the hobbits were never forgotten. Under his reign, the Shire was officially declared a free land, meaning no outside power could ever lay claim to it. In gratitude for the role the hobbits played in the War of the Ring, Aragorn also issued a special decree. No men were allowed to enter the Shire without permission. This simple act made it so that the hobbits could live in peace, undisturbed by the affairs of the outside world. As the rest of Middle-earth moved forward, the hobbits quietly returned to their old way of life. Good food, good company, and the cozy comfort of home. They had witnessed great battles and the fall of dark powers, but their hearts still clung to the joys of everyday living. The hobbits had never gone looking for fame or power, but their part in the War of the Ring is proof that true heroism doesn't always shout. Frodo took on an impossible burden. Sam stayed by his side no matter how dark things got. And Merry and Pippin grew into leaders when their people needed them most. Even the Shire itself, with its quiet resilience, stood strong against everything that tried to tear it down. In the end, the hobbits reminded the world that even the smallest among us can make all the difference.